Thank you very much for the presentation. Well, anti-synthetase syndrome is a rare and heterogeneous systemic autoimmune disease characterized by the positivity of an anti-amino acid tRNA synthetase and occurrence of a broad spectrum of clinical features involving many organs. In this picture, you can see some of the most common clinical manifestations of this syndrome, including fever, interstitial lung disease, myositis, arthritis, mechanic hands, or Raynaud phenomena. Connors criteria were the first diagnostic criteria for this syndrome, and based on these criteria, presence of anti-synthetase together with one of the aforementioned clinical manifestations led to the diagnosis of this syndrome. Later on, more complex diagnosis criteria have been proposed as Solomon criteria or Legas criteria, but all of them have in common that the necessity of the presence of an anti-synthetase autoantibody together with some of the clinical manifestations that we have just seen for the diagnosis of this syndrome. Amino acid tRNA synthetases are a family of enzymes that catalyze the charging of amino acids onto their cognate tRNAs for protein synthesis on the ribosomes. For every amino acid, there is an synthetase that catalyzes the reaction that we have just seen, with some exceptions, for example, glutamic acid or proline, that they only have a unique synthetase for both of them, and the same happens for serine and selenocysteine. But the important thing is that the majority of synthetases have been described as autoantigens, to which autoantibodies are directed in this anti-synthetase syndrome. And the majority of autoantibodies only recognize one synthetase, but in the case of anti-OEA, these autoantibodies recognize different synthetases because all of these synthetases are part of a big molecular protein complex that is in the cytoplasm. And the first anti-synthetase autoantibody to be reported was anti-YO1, and it was discovered in idiopathic inflammatory myopathies. And the rest of anti-synthetase autoantibodies have been described also first in idiopathic inflammatory myopathies and have been traditionally linked to this disease. But nowadays, we know that anti-synthetase syndrome is an independent entity, and some patients present with idiopathic inflammatory myopathy, but some of them won't present myositis and will present with ILD and other clinical manifestations that we have seen, like mechanic hands or others. Normally, it's thought that anti-YO1 is the most prevalent anti-synthetase autoantibody, but you have to take in count that these prevalences are on idiopathic inflammatory myopathies and not in anti-synthetase syndrome. And normally, anti-YO1 positive patients with anti-synthetase syndrome present with a higher prevalence the clinical feature of myositis, while other patients with other autoantibodies do not present myositis or not with a high prevalence and predominantly present interstitial lung disease, for example, anti-PL7. So we have said that the presence of an anti-synthetase autoantibody together with some not very specific clinical symptoms can lead to the diagnosis of this syndrome. So it's very important to have a reliable method to detect these autoantibodies. With this in mind, the objective of this study was to evaluate the performance of a widely used commercial assay for detecting anti-PL7 autoantibodies, one of these anti-synthetases, using gold standard assay immunoprecipitation. For this purpose, we selected patients that were highly positive for anti-PL7 autoantibody by our commercial assay that we have in the laboratory, and we have 14 patients that were highly positive for this autoantibody by this commercial assay. In all of them, we performed RNA immunoprecipitation, and also in one of the patients, we performed protein immunoprecipitation because the results of RNA immunoprecipitation were not conclusive at all. And also, we determined antinuclear autoantibodies by indirect immunofluorescence in 13 of them because there was no sample available for one of the patients. For RNA immunoprecipitation, we incubated protein-A cephalous beads with sera of the patient in a way that these beads get coupled with the IgG of the sera. And these beads are then incubated with a cell extract that comes from a human cell line. This protein extract represents the human autoantigen repertoire, and in the case of RNA immunoprecipitation, we are interested in ribonucleoproteins that are formed by proteins and also RNA molecules, for example, tRNA synthetases. In this case, if the patient presents an autoantibody that can recognize this ribonucleoprotein, this ribonucleoprotein will get attached. And after that, we will do a nucleic acid extraction, and we will get this RNA molecule isolated. And after that, we will run a gel, and depending on the molecular weight of this RNA molecule, together with control reference area, we can sometimes determine the autoantibody that is recognizing that autoantigen that contains the RNA molecule. In the case of protein immunoprecipitation, the process will be very similar. We will have beads coupled with the IgG, and we will incubate them with protein extract coming from a human line cell. But in this case, the proteins have to be labeled, and for that, what we do is to incubate the cells in a media without methionine, in which an homologue is added, and this homologue is tagged with an acido group. In this way, all the proteins that are synthesized by the ribosomes will have these proteins tagged with the acido group because they will add acidoamolanin instead of methionine. And after incubating the beads with these protein extracts, if there is an autoantibody that can recognize this protein, it will get bound. And after that, we do a clip reaction in which an alkyl group bound to a fluorochrome is incubated with the beads, and the acido and alkene group get combined in a way that the proteins get marked with fluorescence. So we can easily visualize them in a gel, and same as the RNA molecules, we can detect them by the molecular weight and also using reference area. So here you can see the results of the RNA immunoprecipitation of the majority of the patients included in the study. We included a healthy donor where we can see two unspecific bands corresponding to ribosomal RNA that will be seen in all of the patients. Also, we included a control that was positive for anti-EJ, another anti-synthetase that showed these bands here, that is the height of tRNAs. Here you can see the input of total RNA coming from nucleic acid extraction of the protein extract coming from the cell line. And you can see clearly that some patients that were supposed to be positive for anti-synthetase don't show any band at this height, while others present the typical band for anti-PL7, for example, patient 2, 4, 6, 7, and 9. Also, we can see that some of the patients present also other bands corresponding to other autoantibodies like anti-Rho60 or anti-U1 RNIP, and they were already known by the commercial assays on these patients. Patient 12 was not only highly positive for anti-PL7, but also highly positive for other anti-synthetase, anti-PL12. It was positive by RNA immunoprecipitation, but sometimes with RNA immunoprecipitation it's complicated to differentiate between different anti-synthetases because we obtain bands in the same height with different patterns, but quite similar between them. So we decided to do a protein immunoprecipitation. You can see here the results with a healthy donor, an anti-PL12 positive control that shows a band at 120 kilodaltons. Patient 11 that was PL7 positive and confirmed by RNA immunoprecipitation that shows around 90 kilodaltons, and patient 12 that clearly presents a band similar to the anti-PL12 positive control, so it's considered also a false positive for PL7, but a true positive for PL12. You can see here the results summarized. Only 43% of the anti-PL7 positive samples by the commercial assay were confirmed by immunoprecipitation. All the samples that were positive by immunoprecipitation show cytoplasmic dense fine speckled pattern by indirect immunofluorescence, that it's the pattern associated with this autoantibody, so it makes sense. While, well, you can see here the pictures of the indirect immunofluorescence with the clear cytoplasmic staining, while the rest of the patients didn't show this pattern, except for one, the patient 12 that was positive for anti-PL7, that also presents the same pattern, so it also makes sense. And here you can see the other patients that were negative for PL7 presenting different indirect immunofluorescent patterns, and patient 12 also presented the same cytoplasmic pattern due to the anti-PL7 autoantibody. So as conclusions, less than half of the anti-PL7 positive samples by the commercial assay were confirmed by immunoprecipitation, either RNA immunoprecipitation or protein immunoprecipitation. Anti-PL7 positive samples by commercial assay that do not present the cytoplasmic pattern by indirect immunofluorescence should not be considered as antisynthetase positive for diagnosis of antisynthetase syndrome, as probably are false positives. Patients that are positive for more than one antisynthetase and have the cytoplasmic pattern should be studied by protein immunoprecipitation, as double positivity has rarely been described, and probably is also due to a false positive. And I want to thank the group of immunology and also the group of internal medicine and rheumatology, because without them this work would have not been possible.
Any question? The people that is working in autoimmunity in this room, do we have any question?
One question after the result.
That? Yeah?
Yeah, well, I don't have a question, but I'm very happy with this work because it's very interesting. And it's confirming that, for example, we are using the same commercial kit and we know we have discrepancies with diagnosis. And this antigen in this kit is not working.
But for me, it's important because I think in Catalonia it's pretty clear that the indirect immunofluorescent pattern has a very...
Immunofluorescence is still necessary in many areas of autoimmunity diagnosis, and that it must be performed correctly, and not everybody is going to do it correctly.
Yes, but sometimes when we go to a Spanish Congress, you hear some people saying that indirect immunofluorescence doesn't serve for anything, and they say that all the positives by the commercial assays are positive, and they don't think anything more. So.
He's teaching to me in order to understand the field of the autoimmunity, sorry.
No question.
Okay.
Very interesting, everybody, no? So.
Perfect.